The discipline of content strategy has been around for about 20 years now. It's evolved a lot over that time span. From its humble beginnings as a practice devoted to translating print content into web pages, content strategy has grown into a sophisticated multidisciplinary business practice. Nowadays, content strategists contribute to digital products that we could not have imagined 20 years ago. Erin Golden and her colleagues at Publicis Sapient have come up with an innovative model to illustrate this evolution.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 78 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Erin Golden. Erin is an experienced designer and a content strategist at the agency Publicis Sapient. I believe you're in the DC area, but Publicis Sapient is all over the world, right? Well, anyhow, welcome, Erin, and tell the folks a little bit more about what you do there at Publicis Sapient.
Thanks, Larry. I'm thrilled to be here. As you mentioned, I'm a content strategist and experienced designer, and you are correct. Publicis Sapient is a global company, but I am located in the DC area. And I've been in the DC area for most of my career, and therefore it's probably not surprising that I've spent a lot of time in the government, the nonprofit world, also quite a bit of higher education. I've held a bunch of different titles within content strategy and UX design. I've been an information architect, a user experience designer, a content management specialist, a copywriter. So I've kind of done a range of different things, and I'm experienced in leading projects, for anywhere from the discovery phase all the way through development. And kind of as of late, I'm really passionate about where content strategy is intersecting with user and audience research. I'm kind of into learning more about how I can incorporate all types of data into my practice.
Cool. Yeah, and I think we're all wrestling with that. But I want to back up quickly to why I wanted to have you on the show, because you and Wendy Johansson, also from Publicis Sapient, did this great presentation at the Design and Content Conference. Was it a couple weeks ago? And you talked about, because when you were just describing your diverse background and how you came to where you are today, there's sort of a bigger way to look at that. And you and Wendy did that in that presentation. You looked at the evolution of content strategy practice and kind of juxtaposing it with this Kardashev scale, which is this kind of cosmological, astronomical concept for the development of maturity of, or the development of galactic systems. But I love the way you applied that. Tell me a little bit about how you and Wendy came to arrive at that model. And for the folks who weren't at the conference, maybe just a quick overview of what you talked about.
Sure. Right. So my colleague, Wendy Johansson, and I presented a version of content strategy and design evolution using the Kardashev scale as a metaphor. As you suggested, it was a theory developed by an astrophysicist, I think in the 60s, Nikolai Kardashev. And the theory was basically that a culture's status can be sort of determined by the amount of energy it has harnessed and the amount of technological abilities it has developed as a result of that energy. So in short, social systems that demonstrate strong technological capabilities are considered to be more advanced. So that's kind of the basis of the theory. And how it came into my life and Wendy's life is our chief experience officer at Publicis Sapient, John Maida, actually developed a metaphor using the Kardashev scale for digital business transformation in kind of a macro way. And he did that to contextualize what we mean when we say digital business transformation. And as Wendy and I were talking about the evolution of practice, we kind of realized hey, John's idea around Kardashev and DBT makes a lot of sense, but how can we dig a little bit deeper? And how can we look at it a little more closely from a content strategy perspective? And so we did. And the scale, for those who weren't able to see the presentation, is a 5-level scale. And it's essentially a maturity model is what we have developed. So level 1 through level 5, and we kind of talked through where we thought content strategy was at each of those levels.
Right, and the way it was sort of like both historical and developmental in that it's sort of like for each decade. You said in the 90s we were doing it this way, in the early 2000s we were doing it this way, and now the last. Can you kind of just outline each of those 5 stages that you identified?
Sure. Right. And I think, and the decades thing, I think, happens to be more coincidental than anything. It's not something we would necessarily say, oh, because, the truth is you can exist at any point on the scale today. I think in the description of it and sort of land the metaphor, it's helpful to understand some of that time-based context. But, want to understand that not everyone, there's a lot of K1, today. So to explain what that means, K1 to K5, the way we talked about it was K1 from a content strategy perspective was really grounded in sort of the copywriting discipline. And this speaks to a time where content strategy was just emerging as a discipline, or hadn't even emerged yet, I guess. It was kind of things, you were transferring information and content from paper to the web. And essentially, if you were involved in any kind of online production, it was generally in the form of copywriting. And then as we move sort of into the K2 phase, this is where we saw the discipline of content strategy emerge in earnest. And I think in a lot of ways that came out of writers sort of being forced to fit their content into a design after the design had already been created, and understanding that not only was that sort of a backwards way of doing things, we should stop and think about our editorial process, stop and think about what we are creating. Just because we move from a print structure to sort of a seemingly endless horizon of the online world, that does not mean we should just create and create and create. So that was kind of moving from K1 to K2 and asking some of those questions around content strategy. The K3 was getting into sort of the social and commerce phase of the web. So kind of leaving behind Web 2.0, moving into more of the participatory web landscape. And from the content strategy perspective, we talked about this meaning really having to understand your content ecosystem and reckoning with the idea that it's no longer sufficient to just push. Pull has to start to happen. This is where we started to see SEO really come into the conversation. This is where content marketing kind of grew into the conversation. And understanding kind of what those journeys look like, that the journey does not begin on your homepage. It does not likely begin on your landing page, and really reckoning with that reality. K4 is sort of, I guess, where big tech is today. We were calling this product experiences. And I think from the content perspective, that means more of a structured style of content development and content management, getting into sort of atomic content strategies, moving away from the page-based model of content development and content publication. And also this is where I think content design has come into play in earnest, where we're starting to understand that we need to explore content and user research together, understand that we need to be, that we're producing for people and humans with needs, and how to understand what those needs and preferences and expectations are in order to deliver the right content. It's like we are understanding it's no longer sufficient to produce from such an organizational perspective. Mm-hmm. And then K5, was kind of held out as the AI sort of artificial intelligence sort of era. And we talked about this in many ways and kind of not knowing what this means, but having some conversation around, as artificial intelligence grows, what does that mean for content strategy? How will our jobs begin to be affected? And that was really just kind of an unknown sort of part of the conversation that was kind of fun to have, but raises some important questions as well.
Yeah, when you got to that part during the presentation, I was like, oh no, this is the dystopic future coming and the robots are going to put us all out of jobs. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's sort of like the way you set it up. I don't know if you meant to do it that way, but I was kind of like, oh my God, where's this going? But I love the way that, one thing you mentioned, that this is very much like a maturity model. And there's a lot of folks in content strategy have developed various content maturity models and approaches. But I think of Jared Spool's approach to UX maturity. I don't know if you've ever seen him present on that. I've seen him talk about it a few times. And he's careful to point out that, like, from any one like product or business unit or wherever, you can have like different levels of maturity at different places in an organization, or even across a product team or another team. So there's sort of that evolutionary model, but then there's like, not everybody's on the execs, not everybody's going to be at K1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the same time. Have you observed that? And have you figured out how to, like, it seems like there's some reconciliation that needs to happen if you have people on different pages.
Sure. I've experienced it. Short answer is, I wish I had the answer of how to resolve this, but I think we're all working through this in different ways right now. To answer your question around Jared Spool's work, I've seen that presentation. I've followed his thinking and his work there, and I've been certainly inspired by it. And what I appreciate around his, how he talks about maturity models, what I appreciate around how John Maeda talks about maturity models and talks about the Kardashev scale, is a normalization that we are not all in the same place. And that is okay. That I tend to think, even when we talked about the K scale in the conference, and even when you and I have had a conversation about it, you kind of tend to get in this sort of reminiscy kind of, this was funny and fun. But when there was no responsive web and you had one web page, we kind of can talk about those and laugh about it. But the thing is it's not meant to shame an organization or a group for not being further along in the scale. I think it's just meant as a reality check for us to say, okay, where are we and what are the possibilities? And what is the value of moving towards those possibilities? And I think that's the conversation that you have to have inside of an organization. And I think what you have to bring to that conversation is maybe any number of maturity models where the organization can see themselves reflected, depending on what you're trying to solve. Mm-hmm. With regard to content, I think it's exactly the same thing. We can point out some of the realities that have differentiated the eras as a way of talking about the value of working differently and of accepting new skills into our practice and understanding what that will do for us, what that will do for our customers and our users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think you're getting at one of my favorite things about content strategy practice. I think at its foundation, it's very pragmatic. You work with what you got. And if you have, like, whatever the dynamic is, if a business unit isn't funded enough or trained enough to get up a level or two where you'd like to see them, you just kind of work with what you have. Does that resonate with you? Does that?
It certainly does, because you have to do what you have to do. However, I like to sort of push, and I like to find the space, the project, the section to say, what if we did this? And that's what I really like about some of new, not so new, ideas that have come into the software development world and have started to trickle into content and into UX around managing uncertainty, around exploring the value of solutions, around creating feedback loops. So I like to push and see where we can bring in a new tool, where we can bring in a new methodology, and what we can learn from that, and kind of, incrementally advance if there's not an opportunity to advance more holistically.
Yep. No, that makes, I think, yeah, I was maybe being too passive and accepting of it. That like I love it because at the user end, you definitely want it to be pull. You want to be pulled by the users to what they need and deserve. Whereas on the inside, as a practitioner, it's more like, no, I know better ways to do this, and I'm going to help you identify those and push forward. You know, one thing you said, and apropos of that, this might connect. When you were talking about like I think it was stage 2 in the Kardashev scale, where you're just starting to get this notion of like, no, this isn't about filling a field that somebody put in a CMS, that we are, you know, and we talked earlier before the show about your notion of content first and how taking a genuinely content first approach. I think that's one of the earliest evolutionary stages, like as a practitioner, when you get to where you can confidently go in and say, that's a beautiful design, but like, here's the content we got. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Right. I thought a lot about content first, you know, since you and I last had a conversation, because, you know, it did kind of hit me. Content first, I've worked in a lot of information rich experiences with folks who understand content first. So I feel lucky in that way. So my sort of autopilot content first response is valid. You know, I'm firmly in the camp that form follows function. When we seek to create any sort of visual or verbal experience, you know, we have to ask, what is the substance of this experience and how can we design around that? You know, otherwise you risk the containers being all wrong, as you suggested. And this is what content strategy was born out of in many ways. So when I think of content first, I sort of think of that idea of form follows function. But one thing I kind of would like to raise is I kind of wonder if we're moving into sort of a new era of, you know, research first. I think if we get into the idea, as I was alluding to earlier, of kind of what does it mean when information is the product? And I think that we've existed in a world, you know, business has long, in the product and business world, you've long had to understand what is the value of the solution I'm creating, how is it going to resonate with my users, but yet in sort of the more information-rich experiences in the public sector that I've worked in, you know, others, we've kind of existed allowing this idea that users will kind of come to us and sort through what's there and then determine if it fits their needs or not. Okay, so I think we are sort of moving out of that era to more of a research first era and sort of beginning to apply, you know, the industry adage, I guess, build the right thing, build the thing right.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think that there is sort of a collective understanding of the role of content practitioners in the build the right thing part of the process. And that's why I'm kind of leaning into an idea, understanding, yes, content first when you're building the thing, but the role of research and content strategy in the first part of the phase, in the build the right thing part of the phase, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think you know, there's so many ways to organize at the highest level, kind of what we do in that British Design Council double diamond of discover, define, develop, deliver. You know, that's kind of what you're getting at there. It also, though, but you're just reminding me, I actually wrote down this quote from our conversation a week or so ago. You said the war will be won by understanding users. And a huge amount of that work in the discover and define stage is all about listening to users and doing more research. And you've talked already a little bit about research. Tell me how, I think kind of almost embarrassed in an embarrassed way about like how we used to just crank out content. You just get an idea and you'd kind of do it. Like I came out of journalism, you assign the story, you write the story, you know, and boom, there it goes. Now it's like, wait a minute. So tell me more about how your practice has changed as you've had this more kind of user-centric, research-based approach.
I think that's exactly it. I think we all came out, not all of us, I think many of us came out of the journalistic way of working where you get to decide what should we write about. Of course, you want to understand what resonates with your readers at some level. I'm not dismissing that. But I think in the information landscape, it's becoming obvious that we cannot flood our platforms and our systems with whatever is important to the organization. And it's becoming obvious because of how much competition there is for eyeballs and traffic. So I think that we are beginning to understand that what happens around editorial decision making, that needs to draw from a stronger feedback loop with our audiences and with our customers, and kind of get that machine up and running so that we can understand what are the needs and how can we deliver on that, and kind of starting to also step away, I think, from the idea that once something is published, it needs to stay exactly that way for a long time. I'm wondering if we can start to accept iteration even at the content level. And so kind of moving away from some of these ideas around how we decide what to produce and what the life cycle looks like for that piece of content. How often are we going back and taking feedback and making changes?
Right. I think that's a fundamental change that, again, in terms of like your maturity model, we're all at different places in our maturity towards recognizing that like, you don't just create a piece of content, put it there and it's there forever. That like the evolution of, I don't know if you do much SEO work at Publicis Sapient, but that's a place where that shows up a lot. And that there's often been in that world like a concern with like, oh my God, we got to harvest all the long tail search results, so we need all this content out there. But I think increasingly, I don't follow it as closely as I used to, but my hunch is that I'm seeing many more of my long-term search inquiries in Google point me to a bigger page. And Google has this new thing, I don't know exactly how they're doing it, but they're highlighting the content in a page that answers your query. So you don't need separate pages anymore to address that. This kind of gets it. I don't know if you follow Jerry McGovern, but Jerry's like, look, you guys, 90% of the content on the web is crap. Get rid of it and just give the users what they want.
Yeah, I think that I agree. I think the how of doing that, obviously is the hard part. I've had the great fortune to work with some very smart SEO colleagues, and bringing SEO data and the practice of SEO into our content strategy and content development practice, has been an adventure at times, trying to figure out who is leading the dance here. And reckoning with that and dealing with what we're understanding about usage, what we can or cannot gather about user intent from that data, how we can triangulate with data that can inform those sorts of things. So the more inputs we have does not always seem to make it easier.
Right. Well, and that's the generic problem you alluded to earlier, that like we're all just inundated with information, and how is that additional piece of information, wherever it comes from in whatever context, how is that actually going to help? In this case, you're talking about sort of the content strategy practitioner as the user of some new like SEO practice or content marketing thing or something like that. Yeah, I used to do a lot of SEO and for many years, but it started back in the late 90s. And one of the things I loved about it right from the get-go is it was the most user-focused, customer-centric business practice out there. You had to get inside your user's brain to have any success. And I think about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the SEO practitioners really recognized that satisfying user intent is like how you curry favor with Google. And that brings us right back to your interest in user research, research and user centricity. Do you see all this stuff? I guess we talked about this, and that's sort of like SEO is one of these allied practices along with like, information architecture and just user experience design in general. Do you see all these sort of allied fields kind of converging, or how does that manifest in your work?
In my experience, I've seen them converging. I've had, and some of that is my own doing. I have sort of, whenever I have tried to specialize, it never seems to stick. I'm always kind of expanding the horizon of what I feel is important to know to do my best work. So, writing led writing led to content strategy, and visual design led me to UX and IA, and now UX has really led me toward a deeper interest in research and data. All of that has led me towards an interest in lean and agile and design thinking. So I guess I can only talk about my experience, but I do think that there is some energy around generalizing, being important right now, and being able to come in to a team or an engagement or a meeting and have an understanding end to end about what experience means. So that's how I approach my work. I think looking at it in a little more, at face value, I think most people would agree that there's overlap between several parts of the discipline. But I don't want to dismiss the idea of specializing at any one step or in any one facet, because I know that there is value in deep understanding as well. So I think it kind of depends on how you like to work, and maybe it depends on your organization or your team. I can only speak to my experience. I have a hard time gatekeeping between all of these different disciplines or facets.
Yep. No, I struggle with the same thing. And I sometimes wonder if I'm an idiot for having cast as wide a net as I have over the field of content strategy in my current approach to it. But at the same time, you just talked about a lot of the benefits of being a generalist and having, I think it's being able to make those connections that results in better content strategy practice. And like, if you understand what the SEOs want, how information architects organize things, how user experience designers understand their users, if you understand all that stuff, you're going to be a better content strategist, but you certainly won't be acknowledged as any kind of a specialist.
Right. And I guess that's sort of the trade-off that we have to make. I kind of start to see it as having a full command of the questions that can be asked and the way they can be answered in order to produce the right thing and to produce it well. That's kind of where I am, is what do we need to learn and how can we learn it? And that's kind of the question that guides me towards all of these different places.
I think I'm seeing where your interest in research is coming from. That's you kind of just described the need for that. Hey, Erin, I noticed we're already coming up on time. These always go so quickly. But before we wrap up, I always like to make sure, is there anything that we haven't talked about or that's just on your mind that you want to share with the folks before we close?
The time did fly by. I think in terms of what we haven't, I think we've talked about a lot of important things and had a chance to discuss a lot of what I've been thinking about. I will just kind of throw the other angle that we had discussed at one point that I'd love to come back to at some point and am continuing to learn about. Because I've talked a lot about what's important to me kind of at the product level and how product and content are kind of merging in my world right now. There's also kind of the more specialized parts of this, and for me right now, that's structured and atomic content, and what that means and where that's going and what that's going to mean for how we produce and deliver content in experiences and potentially in other contexts.
Yep, no, I think you're absolutely right, and we're on the exact same wavelength there. That operating from a non-presentation specific body of content to create the right user experiences. You get into things like personalization, but not even just personalization, but just like creating a decent website or a good app or, whatever it is you're trying to do. That operating from like sensibly organized, structured content that's just how we're going to be operating in the future. And that all of these things we're talking about are going to adapt and change and grow and, slide further down the Kardashev scale as we figure them out.
That's right. That's where I have my eye on in sort of another phase of evolution. So that's what I'm looking out for right now.
Oh, cool. Well, how can we follow your evolution? Erin, what's are you active on social media, or where would you like to connect with folks?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying Twitter, and I can be found at Erin Golden XD.
XD, okay, gotcha. And I'll get that in the show notes as well. Well, thanks so much, Erin. I really enjoyed the conversation. This is fun stuff. And you're right. We need to have a couple more conversations about this as well.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Larry. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
You bet.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.